The sun hung low over the dusty horizon as Maddox stared out at the open plains, his thoughts drifting like the tumbleweeds caught in the breeze. The desert stretched endlessly, its golden sands catching the last light of day. There wasn't a single soul in sight. This was the life he'd chosen, the life of solitude and hard work. He was a rancher, a man who knew how to handle cattle, horses, and the harshest conditions nature could throw his way. He had no interest in the drama of town life, no desire to be involved in anything that wasn't related to his land. Maddox never imagined that the day would come when a woman would ride onto his land, asking for a marriage proposal so bold it shook him to his core. He had heard the rumors, of course. The town gossips couldn't keep their mouths shut, and word had gotten around about Charlotte Holden, the so-called old maid. She was a woman no one had expected to marry, at least not anyone important. But here she was, riding her horse toward him, her face set in a hard line as she drew closer. The wind whipped at her hair, and she wore no fancy dress, no veil, no hint of anything that could be called bridal. Instead, she was a woman of the land, dressed plainly, with a hard look in her eyes, a woman who didn't seem to care about the usual formalities. Charlotte didn't stop at the gate. She urged her horse forward, pulling it to a halt in front of Maddox with a confident air. She didn't smile. She didn't offer pleasantry. She simply looked him in the eye and spoke with a voice that carried the weight of desperation. "I need a husband," she said, blunt and direct, as if it was the most ordinary request in the world. Maddox blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "I don't think I understand." "I'll make it plain then," she continued, her tone steady. "I'm offering you $10,000 to marry me. Today." The offer hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Maddox's eyes narrowed as he tried to read her. Was this some sort of joke? $10,000 wasn't a small sum, not in these parts. It was more money than most folks saw in a year, maybe even a lifetime. And yet, she seemed serious. "I don't take offers like that lightly," he replied, taking a step back, his hand resting on the fence post, his eyes scanning her for any sign of deceit. "What makes you think I'll just up and marry you?" Charlotte didn't flinch. "Because I need a husband and you need the money," she said. "This is a simple transaction, Mr. Maddox. I'm in danger, and I need protection. You can keep the money, and I'll keep my promise. All I need is someone to stand beside me at the altar. No questions asked." Maddox took a slow breath, trying to process everything she had just said. He was no stranger to danger. He'd faced it many times, from storms to predators, to men looking to take what was his. But what could possibly have her this desperate? Why come to him of all people? His gaze drifted to her horse, strong, lean, and well-kept. It was obvious she wasn't the kind of woman who had grown up in luxury. The roughness in her hands, the wear on her boots, it was all there. This was a woman who had seen hard times, and now, for some reason, was willing to offer him $10,000 for what seemed like nothing more than a contract. "You can't just come in here, offer me money, and expect me to marry you," Maddox said, his voice firm. "There's more to this than you're letting on." Charlotte's expression hardened. "I don't have time to explain it all, Mr. Maddox, but I'm asking you for this one favor. You marry me, and I'll make sure your life here stays exactly as it is. Nothing changes. No one knows about this arrangement. Just you and me, a quiet life." It was too much. Maddox had built this life from the ground up, and it wasn't the sort of thing you could just walk away from. It wasn't a decision to be made lightly. He knew that if he said yes, everything would change. People would talk. It wasn't like he was looking for a wife or even for companionship. His ranch was enough. But the look in Charlotte's eyes, the determination and the fear, told him that this wasn't some scheme. She was in trouble, real trouble, and for reasons he couldn't explain, the weight of her need pressed on him. $10,000 might be tempting, but it wasn't the money that made him hesitate. It was the way she looked at him, as though she was handing him the only lifeline she had left. "I'll need to know more," he said finally, pushing away from the post. "I can't marry you without understanding what's going on." Charlotte's lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a moment, Maddox thought she might refuse to say another word. But then her voice softened, just slightly. "There are people looking for me," she said, her tone quieter now, almost vulnerable. "People who want me dead. And if I don't get married soon, they'll come for me. I'm running out of time, Mr. Maddox. Maddox's brow furrowed. His gut told him that whatever this was, it was bigger than just, who's after you? What did you do to get yourself in this kind of trouble? Charlotte shook her head, her eyes darkening. I can't tell you that, not yet. There it was, the truth hidden in plain sight. She wasn't asking him for a favor. She was asking for protection from people who could be dangerous, people who might come after him too if they found out what was going on. It was a risky proposition, but Maddox had been through enough to know when something needed to be done. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life he understood the meaning of sacrifice. He was being asked to give up something for a complete stranger, to risk everything for someone who hadn't given him any reason to trust her. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, a kind of fire that burned beneath her surface, that made him think it might be worth the risk. All right, he said, his voice steady. I'll do it. I'll marry you. But understand this, Charlotte, you'll have to tell me everything. And if this gets too dangerous for me, I'm out. You got that? Charlotte nodded, a faint relief crossing her features, but her eyes never fully softened. She was a woman who didn't trust easily, and Maddox was beginning to understand. The deal was made, but Maddox knew in his heart that nothing would ever be the same again. As they rode toward the town to make the arrangement official, Maddox couldn't help but wonder, what kind of trouble had Charlotte Holden gotten herself into, and what kind of man was he becoming by agreeing to help her? The days after the agreement were quieter than Maddox had anticipated. He had expected more resistance, more questioning, maybe even ridicule from the folks in town, but when Charlotte Holden arrived at his ranch to start their life together, there was nothing but silence between them. The weight of their unspoken arrangement hung in the air, and though the money was already in his pocket, the consequences of their decision weighed heavy on both of them. Charlotte was no longer a stranger to him, but the bond between them was still fragile. She moved through his home like a shadow, quiet, deliberate, yet never quite at ease. Her presence was not unwelcome, but it was a constant reminder of the strange deal they had struck. Every time Maddox glanced at her, he remembered the first time they'd spoken, the $10,000, and the danger she had mentioned. The ranch was big enough to give them both space, but it wasn't big enough to erase the tension between them. Maddox had expected their marriage to be an easy one, just a formality, a quick exchange of vows, a quiet life to follow. What he hadn't expected was Charlotte's strength. She wasn't like the women he had known, the ones who cooked and cleaned with a gentle smile and waited for their husbands to return from the fields. Charlotte didn't do things like that. She didn't need him to protect her, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made him feel like he needed to watch out for her anyway. Her first days on the ranch were filled with little things Maddox hadn't anticipated but couldn't help but admire. She moved like a woman who had spent years working the land, though she didn't have the rough calluses of a rancher. The way she handled a shovel, planting vegetables in the small garden near the house surprised him. She was efficient, never wasting time, never asking for help. When the weather grew too hot, she took care of the animals without a second thought, and when Maddox returned to the house, she had already prepared the meals and set the table. It wasn't just that Charlotte could hold her own, it was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet dignity in her every move. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were always direct, always to the point. It wasn't the way women in town spoke, all sweetness and soft syllables. Charlotte's voice had a bite to it, like the edge of a blade that had been worn smooth over years of use. One evening, as Maddox sat at the table scraping the last remnants of his meal onto his plate, he glanced over at Charlotte. She was sitting across from him, her eyes focused on the fire burning in the hearth, her mind clearly somewhere else. He had been watching her more and more these past few days, trying to figure her out. There was something there, something he couldn't place, and it gnawed at him. "How long are we going to keep up this charade?" Maddox asked, his voice breaking the silence. "You've got your money. I've got my land. What are we doing here, Charlotte?" Charlotte didn't flinch. She set down her fork, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. "We're surviving," she said simply. "That's all it is, Maddox. Nothing more, nothing less." Her words struck a chord in him, though he didn't show it. Maddox had thought about her words more than he cared to admit. "Surviving?" he asked. "Is that really all we're doing? Just surviving?" She gave a small nod, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. Surviving until we can get on with our lives. Surviving until the danger passes. Right, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. The danger. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was maddening, the way Charlotte could be so composed, so distant. He wanted to know more, to pry into her past, to understand why she was running. But every time he asked, she shut him out. She wasn't the type to open up easily, and that frustrated him. Maddox wasn't used to feeling like an outsider in his own home, especially when he was supposed to be the one taking care of things. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and met her eyes. "When are you going to tell me the truth?" Charlotte didn't flinch, but her gaze softened just enough to let him know that she understood. She exhaled slowly, her hand tightening around the cup. "I'll tell you when it's safe. When I know I can trust you." Her words hit him like a cold wave, and for the first time since they'd been married, Maddox felt truly alone. He had agreed to this, had taken her as his wife, and yet she was still a stranger. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that they could make this work, but every time he tried to connect with her, she pulled away. The days passed, and with them the tension between them grew. They didn't fight, they didn't argue, but there was a distance that could not be ignored. Charlotte remained a ghost in his house, moving, working and existing beside him, but never truly part of his world. Maddox did what he always did when he was troubled. The ranch didn't take care of itself, and he had learned long ago that if you kept your hands busy, your mind would follow. But even as he mended fences, tended to the cattle and worked the land, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was a week into their arrangement when Charlotte surprised him. They had been out on horseback, checking the far reaches of the ranch when a storm came in out of nowhere. The sky darkened, and the wind kicked up, swirling dust and sand across the plain. Maddox cursed under his breath, knowing they had to get back before the storm hit full force. But Charlotte had other plans. Without a word she spurred her horse forward, urging it into a full gallop. Maddox watched in stunned silence as she rode into the storm, her dark figure a silhouette against the swirling wind. For a moment, he thought she had lost her mind. Then he saw it, the ranch house in the distance, its roof creaking under the weight of the wind. If they didn't hurry, they'd be trapped outside with the storm coming in fast. He spurred his own horse forward, chasing after her. The wind howled, cutting through the air like a blade, but Charlotte didn't slow. She rode with a kind of fury Maddox had never seen before, her determination driving her forward, even against the odds. When they reached the house, Charlotte was already dismounting, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Maddox followed suit, his heart racing from the adrenaline. "That was reckless," he said, his voice hoarse from the wind. Charlotte didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she grabbed a blanket from the porch and wrapped it around herself, her face set in a grim line. "You don't know what it's like to run from something," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the storm. "To have the wind at your back and not know if you'll make it to the next shelter before you're caught. That's how I live, every day." The admission hung in the air, heavy and real, and for the first time Maddox understood. She wasn't just a woman trying to escape her past. She was a woman fighting for survival. And maybe, just maybe, that was why she had agreed to this marriage, to find a safe haven, to find someone who could stand beside her in the storm. As the rain began to pour down, Maddox stood there, watching her, and for the first time he didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. There was a connection between them now, fragile and unspoken, but it was there, and it was enough to make him wonder if this strange arrangement could turn into something more. It was a day like any other on the ranch, hot, dry, with the sun beating down on the earth, making the very air shimmer with the heat. Maddox was in the barn, fixing a broken fence post, when he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approach. At first he thought it was one of the hands, maybe coming to deliver news or check on the cattle, but something in the rhythm of the gallop felt wrong, too fast, too urgent. He wiped the sweat from his brow and peered out, squinting into the distance. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but he knew that Ryder knew that silhouette. It was Gregory Holt, Charlotte's cousin, the very man Charlotte had been running from. Maddox's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, he bolted from the barn and ran toward the house. He didn't know why Gregory was here or what he wanted, but one thing was certain: trouble was following Charlotte once again. As Gregory's horse grew closer, Maddox's mind raced. He didn't trust the man. There was something off about him. He'd heard the rumors, and in the few brief moments he'd seen him in town, there had always been a strange coldness to him, something in his eyes that Maddox didn't like, something that felt predatory. But he had no idea how far Gregory's reach went, or how much danger he might bring with him. Charlotte was inside the house, her usual calm demeanor, hiding the storm of emotions that Maddox knew must be brewing beneath the surface. He couldn't understand why she was so determined to keep everything to herself. Why couldn't she just tell him what was going on? But before he could get inside, the door swung open, and Charlotte stepped onto the porch, her eyes locking with his. She didn't need to say a word. Maddox could see the fear in her eyes, the way her body tensed, the way her hand instinctively went to the doorframe as if she were trying to keep herself grounded. "Gregory," she said quietly, her voice flat. It was as though the name alone was enough to carry the weight of everything she had been running from. Maddox looked at her, his hand resting on the doorframe. "What's he doing here?" Charlotte shook her head, her jaw set. "I don't know. I told him I didn't want anything to do with him anymore." "Then why is he here?" Maddox demanded, his voice rising slightly. His protective instincts were kicking in, and the last thing he wanted was to see Charlotte put in danger again. Before she could respond, Gregory's voice rang out from behind them, too loud, too sudden. "Well, looks like the little lady has a new protector." Gregory's voice was smooth, but it had an edge to it, one that sent a chill down Maddox's spine. "Tell me, Maddox, do you really know what you're getting yourself into?" Maddox turned slowly, sizing up the man standing in front of him. Gregory was tall, lean, with dark eyes that didn't seem to miss anything. He had the air of someone used to getting what he wanted, and in that moment, Maddox could see the darkness in him more clearly than ever before. "I know enough," Maddox replied, his tone even though the tension in his jaw was evident, "and I suggest you leave now." Gregory chuckled, a dry sound that seemed to mock him. "Leave? You really think I'm going to walk away from this? Charlotte's mine, Maddox. She's been mine long before you came along." Charlotte's eyes widened in panic, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're wrong, Gregory," she said, her voice firm but steady. "I'm not yours. I never was." Maddox felt her words like a weight in his chest. He had known there was something between Charlotte and Gregory, a past that wasn't pretty, but hearing it out loud, hearing it spoken with such finality, made it feel real in a way that nothing else had. It made him realize just how much he still didn't know about her, about the life she had lived before this marriage. Gregory took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Charlotte. "You think you can just run away from everything? You think you can hide here with him and forget what you've done? You've got another thing coming." Maddox moved instinctively, stepping between them, placing himself between Gregory and Charlotte. "You'd best get off my land, Gregory," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Gregory sneered, taking another step closer. "You think you can protect her? She doesn't need you. She never has. But I'll make sure you both regret this little arrangement." Maddox's hand hovered over his gun, but he didn't draw it. He didn't want to escalate this further. He didn't want violence, but if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate to do what was necessary. "Gregory," Charlotte spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is over. You can't control me anymore." Gregory froze, his eyes flashing with something dark and dangerous. "You think I won't come for you, Charlotte? You think I'll just let you go?" Charlotte stood her ground, her face hardening. "You've already done enough. Leave now, or I'll make sure you regret it." Maddox could feel the shift in the air. The tension between them was palpable, thick with years of unspoken history and buried resentment. For a moment it looked as though Gregory might snap, but then, with a final glance at Charlotte, he turned on his heel and spurred his horse forward. "Fine," he spat, his voice bitter. "You'll regret this, Charlotte. Both of you." Maddox stood there, watching him disappear into the distance. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, his heart racing, but as the sound of hooves faded, a strange silence settled over the ranch. The storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered. Charlotte let out a slow breath, as though she had been holding it in the entire time. Maddox turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "What was that all about?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still edged with the questions he needed answers to. Charlotte hesitated before speaking. "He's dangerous, Maddox. And I don't just mean physically. He's manipulative, I've tried to get away from him for years. He won't stop. He can't stand the idea that I'm no longer under his control. Maddox took a step closer, his hand reaching out to her. Why didn't you tell me this before? I couldn't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't trust anyone, not even you. Maddox's heart ached for her, for the pain and fear she had carried for so long. He wanted to reach out to hold her, to make her understand that she didn't have to face this alone anymore. But he knew that trust, once broken, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. He stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. But then, he spoke the only thing he could think to say. We'll deal with him, Charlotte. You don't have to face him alone anymore. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his, and for the first time in weeks, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it wasn't much, but it was a start. A fragile bond that had been built on trust and necessity was beginning to shift, to take on a new shape. The question now was whether it could survive the storm that was coming their way. The next few days on the ranch felt like a simmering pot, the tension between Maddox and Charlotte rising with each passing moment. The aftermath of Gregory's visit had left a crack in their fragile peace, and neither of them knew how to mend it. For Charlotte, the storm had been more than just the one that raged outside their door. It was the storm inside her, the one she had been running from for years. Maddox had been patient with her, or at least, he had tried to be. He'd learned in the days since Gregory's visit that there were things Charlotte wasn't ready to share. He had tried asking her, tried drawing out the story piece by piece, but each time, she pulled away. The more he pressed, the more distant she became. It was a cycle that frustrated him, one that made him question whether they were ever going to have the kind of relationship he wanted, the kind of bond he could trust. Maddox was no fool. He could feel it, the way Charlotte's walls were built so high, so thick, that even his attempts to connect seemed futile. But the more she pulled away, the more Maddox felt himself drawn to her. The very thing that kept her at arm's length was the thing that made him want to know her more. She was a puzzle, one he couldn't quite solve, and he wasn't sure if he should be trying. On the fourth night after Gregory's visit, Maddox sat at the small kitchen table, the faint light of the oil lamp casting long shadows on the wall. Charlotte had been quieter than usual, her face distant as she prepared their dinner. She moved like a ghost, as though she wasn't fully present, as if she had already checked out. The distance between them was palpable, a silent chasm that neither of them could bridge. Maddox couldn't take it anymore. The silence was suffocating. He set his fork down with a clatter, breaking the stillness. Charlotte looked up, startled. What's going on with you, Charlotte? Maddox asked, his voice softer than he intended, but laced with frustration. You've been shutting me out ever since Gregory left. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Charlotte's eyes flickered with something: pain, anger, guilt, but she quickly masked it, turning her attention back to her plate. I'm just trying to keep things together, Maddox, she replied, her tone tight. You don't need to understand. But Maddox couldn't let it go. I want to understand. Damn it, I'm your husband. I'm the one you're supposed to trust. You don't have to carry all of this alone, but you're making it impossible for me to help you if you keep pushing me away. Her shoulders stiffened at his words, and for a moment, the room was thick with tension. She stood abruptly, walking over to the stove to stir something in a pot, her back to him. You want to help, she said, her voice quiet but bitter. Then leave it alone. I never asked for your help. I never asked for this life. I'm not the kind of woman who needs saving. Maddox's breath caught in his chest. He had expected anger, maybe even a harsh response, but he hadn't expected that. He stood up slowly, stepping toward her, his voice low but firm. Is that what you think this is? You think I'm trying to save you? Charlotte, I'm trying to stand beside you. I'm trying to make this work. I never asked for this either, but we're stuck in it now, and I'm not going anywhere. So either you let me in, or we're both going to drown in this mess. Charlotte's shoulders trembled as she turned to face him, her eyes glassy with emotion. I don't know how to let anyone in, Maddox. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. Not after everything, not after. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Her past, the one she never talked about, the one she ran from. It was more than just a few bad memories. It was something that haunted her, something so deep that it kept her locked in a cage of her own making. Maddox's voice softened, his anger ebbing away, as he saw the vulnerability in her eyes. You don't have to tell me everything, Charlotte. but you have to trust me enough to let me help carry the weight. I don't care about your past. I care about you, and I'm not going to let whatever happened to you keep you from having a future." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for some sign that he wasn't just saying words to make her feel better. And then, in a voice so quiet, Maddox almost missed it, she spoke again. "He used to control me, Maddox. Every part of me, every choice I made, he made for me. I wasn't allowed to do anything without his say-so. And when I tried to leave, when I tried to escape him, he came after me. He always came after me. And I thought I was free, but I was wrong. I'm still running." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Maddox stood there, his heart breaking for her. He could see now the weight she had carried for so long, the fear that had never quite left her. The idea of leaving it all behind, of finally being free, had been a dream that slipped through her fingers every time she thought she was safe. Maddox stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You're not running anymore, Charlotte. Not from me, not from him. We'll deal with this together. You don't have to be afraid anymore." She didn't answer him right away, her gaze dropping to the floor as she fought to keep her composure. But when she finally looked up at him, there was something different in her eyes. A flicker of hope, barely there, but it was "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. "You don't have to believe it all at once," Maddox said, his voice steady. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Charlotte looked as though she was about to say something more. But before she could, the sound of hooves echoed through the still night air, a distant, unmistakable sound that sent a jolt of tension through Maddox's spine. He turned toward the door, instinctively reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he told Charlotte, his voice calm but firm. "I'll check it out." But Charlotte shook her head, her face hardening. "No, I'm not hiding. I've spent enough time hiding." She grabbed a coat and followed him outside, standing beside him as they both stared into the darkening night. The sound of the hooves grew louder, closer now, and then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, riding fast toward the ranch. Maddox's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the rider. It was Gregory. He had come back. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind Gregory rode two more men, rough-looking types who had the air of hired guns about them. Maddox's hand instinctively went to his rifle, but he didn't pull it out yet. He was waiting, watching, trying to figure out what they wanted. Gregory pulled his horse to a halt just outside the gate, his cold eyes locking with Maddox's. "You've got a lot of nerve coming between me and what's mine," he spat. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she faced him. "You need to leave, Gregory. You're not welcome here." But Gregory just laughed, a low, mocking sound. "I'm not here to be welcome, Charlotte. I'm here to take what's mine." Maddox's grip tightened on the rifle, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You won't take anything from here, Gregory," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not while I'm standing here." Gregory's eyes flickered to Maddox, then to Charlotte, and for a moment it was as though the world had stopped moving. The tension was thick, suffocating. Everything was about to change, and in that moment, Maddox knew that the storm they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The tension was unbearable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The storm that had been brewing for months was finally here, and Maddox could feel it in every fiber of his being. Gregory stood before him, his cold eyes glinting with malice as he spurred his horse forward, flanked by two rough-looking men, who appeared to be nothing more than hired guns. Charlotte stood beside him, her face resolute but her body tense, as though she were bracing herself for whatever was about to come. Maddox's heart raced, and every instinct he had screamed at him to protect her, to keep her safe. But in that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about fighting for the life they had built together, for the future they could have. If he let Gregory take her, let him tear them apart, then everything Maddox had worked for, everything he had fought for, would be lost. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, his hand gripping the rifle just a little tighter. Charlotte had told him once that she wasn't afraid anymore, but Maddox knew that fear was still there, deep inside her, because the ghost of Gregory's control still haunted her. and as much as he wanted to believe that he could protect her from it, he knew that the fight they were about to face wasn't just against Gregory. It was a fight against the past she could never quite outrun. "You're making a big mistake, Gregory," Maddox called out, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't have any claim here. This is my land, and Charlotte is my wife." Gregory's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Your wife? That's rich. You think she's yours, Maddox. You think you've somehow saved her from the mess she's made of her life." His gaze flickered to Charlotte and his voice turned cold. "You can't save her, you know. She belongs to me. She always..." Charlotte's breath hitched, but she stood tall, her eyes burning with defiance. "I don't belong to you, Gregory. I never have. You don't own me." Gregory's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Maddox saw the darkness in them, something twisted and wrong. "I own everything about you, Charlotte," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You'll always be mine, and this man you've married, he's just a pawn in my game." Maddox took a step forward, his body tense with the knowledge that this moment could go one of two ways. He could walk away, let Gregory have what he wanted, or he could stand and fight for everything he believed in: the ranch, his marriage, and the woman standing beside him. He had no choice. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. "Get off my land, Gregory," Maddox said, his voice sharp as a knife. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away. After that, there's no going back." Gregory sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The hired guns behind him shifted slightly, their hands hovering near their own weapons, but they didn't make a move. It was clear they were waiting for Gregory's lead, waiting to see what he would do next. Charlotte's eyes flickered to Maddox, and for a brief moment their gazes met. In that fleeting moment, Maddox saw the fear, the hesitation in her eyes, but he also saw something else. It was a spark of something she had hidden from him for so long, something that had been buried deep beneath the surface. She didn't need to say a word. He could see it in her eye. She was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to stop running. Ready to stand by him. Gregory's voice cut through the stillness. "You don't understand, do you, Maddox? You never will. You can't fight what you don't know. You think you're going to protect her. But she's mine, and you can't change." Maddox's fingers tightened around the rifle as the words sank in. He had heard enough. He wasn't going to let Gregory walk away with the last word. "You've already lost, Gregory," Maddox said, his voice deadly calm. "You don't control her anymore. Not now. Not ever." And then it happened. In an instant the world around them exploded into motion. Gregory's hand shot to his gun, and before Maddox could react, the sound of gunfire rang through the air. But it wasn't his rifle that went off. It was one of Gregory's hired guns. Maddox barely had time to register the movement before he was diving to the ground, the bullet whizzing past him and striking the earth where he had been standing just moments before. Charlotte screamed, her hands instinctively reaching for Maddox, but he was already on his feet, his rifle raised and aimed squarely at Gregory's chest. The hired guns were scrambling now, reaching for their weapons, but Maddox's focus never wavered. His eyes were locked on Gregory, and for a brief moment everything else faded away. There was no more fear, no more hesitation. There was only the fight. "Get!" Maddox shouted to Charlotte as he fired a warning shot into the air, signaling to Gregory's men that they were not welcome here. They hesitated for a split second, and was enough. Maddox moved faster than he thought possible, ducking behind the barn and using the structure for cover as the sound of gunfire erupted around them. Charlotte was at his side now, crouching low, her eyes wide with fear, but her movements steady. She had never been in a fight like this before, but Maddox could see that she was more than capable. She was holding her own, even in the chaos. Another shot rang out, this time close. One of Gregory's men fell, clutching his side, and Maddox took the opportunity to push forward, using the barn as cover as he moved toward the edge of the property. Charlotte followed, staying close behind him, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The wind howled around them, making it hard to hear anything but the sounds of the battle. Maddox rounded the corner of the barn, just as Gregory made a move toward the ranch house. Maddox's rifle was already aimed, his finger on the trigger. "Stay away from her," Maddox growled, his voice low and dangerous. Gregory stopped, his hand hovering over his gun as he looked Maddox dead in the eye. There was no fear in Gregory's gaze, but there was something else, something Maddox had seen before. Go ahead, Maddox, Gregory spat, his voice filled with venom. Pull the trigger, you'll still be the one who loses. But Maddox didn't need to pull the trigger. The moment had passed. The threat had been neutralized. The battle was. Gregory's men had been taken down, one by one, either by Maddox's shots or by the overwhelming numbers of the ranch's other hired hands, who had arrived just in time to turn the tide. And as Gregory's lifeless body slumped against the barn, Maddox stood still, his gun raised, his chest heaving with the exertion of the fight. Charlotte stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce light. She looked down at Gregory's body, her breath shaky but steady. For a long moment, she didn't speak, but when she did, her voice was calm, almost cold. He thought he could control me, she whispered, her eyes locked on the lifeless form before them. He was wrong. Maddox lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something, some sign that this moment, this victory, had changed something between them. And when Charlotte met his gaze, he saw it. The walls she had built so high, so thick, were finally starting to crumble. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding from her past. She was standing tall, standing beside him. And in that moment, Maddox knew that this was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them could have imagined when they first agreed to this strange, forced marriage. Charlotte had taken ownership of her own heart, and in doing so she had given Maddox a piece of his own back. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, and in that touch, there was more than just the end of a battle. There was the start of a future they would build together. Let's go home, he said softly, and for the first time in a long time, Charlotte smiled. They had won, and for the first time it felt like they were truly free.